Date: July 16th, 1054. Cardinal Humbert, representing the delegation of the Catholic Church, enters the Hagia Sophia and places a document in front of Patriarch Michael of Constantinople, who is preparing for the liturgy. He then leaves Hagia Sophia and afterwards Constantinople, returning to Rome. The document that Humbert left before the Patriarch declared that the Patriarch had been excommunicated by the Archbishop of Rome, that is, the Pope. On the same day, the Patriarch gathered a church council and excommunicated those who had excommunicated him. Thus, July 16th, 1054 was recorded as the date when the Western and Eastern churches officially separated from one another. What historians call the Great Schism was not actually an event that suddenly emerged. The roots of the events that led to the separation of the two churches extended back hundreds of years. Throughout the Middle Ages, one of the most fundamental debates among Christian clergymen concerned which church possessed universal supremacy. The archbishops of Rome, that is the popes, argued that supremacy belonged to the Western Church because Peter, one of the apostles of Jesus, had come to Rome, established a church there, and was martyred there. According to the claim of the papacy, Peter was the first archbishop of Rome, and those who came after him sat in the papal seat representing him. Jesus himself had also indicated Peter as the founder of the church. In addition, Paul, who made great efforts in spreading Christianity, had also come to Rome, just like Peter, and was martyred there. According to the claim of the Western Church, the bones of both were buried beneath a church in the Vatican. In other words, the Church of Rome was rising upon the two greatest martyrs of Christianity. According to the papacy, all of this was evidence of the universal supremacy of the Archbishopric of Rome. In contrast, the Eastern Church explained its supremacy with a more worldly approach. Constantinople was the capital of the empire and the place where the emperor resided. In the pre-Christian Roman tradition, emperors were considered the head of religious authority. This tradition continued even after the capital of the empire was moved to Constantinople in the 4th century. In other words, emperors such as Constantine, Theodosius, and Justinian had authority in religious matters. In fact, for the Eastern Church, the issue was quite simple. According to them, wherever the emperor was, the church there should be superior to all other churches. This struggle for supremacy, which continued throughout the Middle Ages, played an important role in the widening rift between the Eastern and Western churches. The issue here was not actually whose arguments were more reasonable. Both churches wanted to possess power over the other churches. From what has been explained so far, the cause of the conflict seems to be more political than religious. Yet there was also a cultural dimension to the matter. By the year 1054, there were already several fundamental differences between the two churches that had existed for many years. Although some of them seemed simple, over time they played a role in the division. For example, in the Eastern Church, it had become a tradition for members of the clergy to grow beards, whereas there was no such tradition in the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, priests could marry, while in the Western Church they could not. And one of the biggest problems between the two churches was language. When the Roman Empire was divided into two in 395, the borders that emerged were not only political, but also cultural. In the West, Latin culture was dominant, while in the East, Greek culture prevailed. The official language used by the Western Church was Latin, whereas the language used in the Eastern Church was Greek. Even emperors began speaking and writing in Greek instead of Latin, starting from the 5th century. Over time, language turned into a major problem between the two churches because they could not keep track of the theological debates each other was conducting. For example, in the 5th century, a letter sent from Constantinople remained unanswered for months in Rome because there was no one to translate it. The same situation also applied to Constantinople. Letters sent from Rome were in Latin and therefore were often not considered worth translating. By the 9th century, some clergymen in the Eastern Church were claiming that the Pope spoke the language of barbarians and therefore should never establish authority over Constantinople. Another subject of dispute concerned the doctrine of the Trinity. That is the formula of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In the early years of Christianity, emperors organized a series of councils in order to reach agreement on religious matters that caused controversy. These councils were gatherings where high-ranking clergy came together to discuss religious issues. The first of these was held in 325 in Nicaea, Iznik, by Emperor Constantine. The formula of the Trinity was clarified in the Council of Constantinople in 381. According to this, the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, that is, from God. However, the Western Church changed this in the Council of Toledo in 589, accepting that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and from the Son, that is, from Jesus. The reason they did this was to increase the importance attributed to Jesus, thereby protecting him from heretical views. At first, this did not create a major problem between the two churches because, due to the language issue mentioned earlier, the Eastern Church learned about this decision years later. However, when they did learn about it, their reaction was clear. According to them, this was heresy. Historians call this problem the Filioque issue. The meaning of this Latin word is "and from the Son." In the early period of Christianity, there was no clear hierarchy among the churches. Their relationship generally existed at the level of exchanging information. However, with the decisions taken at the General Councils, 5 churches were considered superior to the others and gained certain authority over the churches in their regions. These were Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Eastern clergymen called this system the Pentarchy, meaning the rule of 5. In its early years, the Archbishopric of Rome was considered to have precedence over the other archbishoprics. However, over time, emperors began attracting the other regional patriarchs to their side in order to increase the importance of Constantinople and gain greater religious authority. This inevitably deepened the separation between East and West. In the early years, popes had to submit to the political power of the emperors. In fact, the support of the emperor was necessary in order to become pope. This situation continued for several centuries. In 726, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III banned the veneration of images and icons of Jesus and the saints. This practice, called iconoclasm, was strongly opposed by Pope Gregory I, who wrote a letter declaring that everyone involved in this movement was excommunicated. However, since the messengers were arrested in Sicily, which was under Byzantine control, the letter never reached Constantinople. In 751, the Lombards began capturing several cities in northern Italy and threatening Rome, which led to the opening of a new chapter in the history of the Catholic Church. The Pope asked for help from the Frankish king Pepin the Short against the Lombards. Pepin, a pious man, gladly accepted this call and entered Italy with his army, defeating the Lombards. Pepin's generosity did not end there. He declared that the lands stretching from Rome to Ravenna were being donated to the papacy. Thus, the Pope became not only the greatest religious authority in the West, but also the ruler of a state located in central Italy. This was a turning point in the history of Christianity. The process continued in the year 800, when Pepin's son Charlemagne was declared emperor by the Pope. At the same time, the throne of the Byzantine Empire was occupied by Empress Irene, a woman. According to widely accepted views, the emperor was supposed to be male. With the crowning of Charlemagne, the emperor now resided in the West, and theoretically, supremacy had passed to the West as well. Although Irene was deposed in 802 and replaced by Nikephoros, neither the papacy nor the Franks accepted abandoning their claims over the imperial title. The situation naturally led to an even deeper division. However, the event that caused the final break occurred shortly after the Normans conquered southern Italy. Previously, a large part of southern Italy had been under Byzantine control. Beginning in the 11th century, these regions gradually fell into the hands of the Normans, who were loyal to the Catholic Church. However, there was a problem. The churches located there continued to conduct their liturgies according to the traditions determined by the East. In 1053, the Pope issued a decree requiring these churches to adopt the Latin liturgy. Otherwise, they would all be closed. This decision was met with anger in the East, and in retaliation, the Patriarch declared that all Latin churches in Constantinople would be closed. The disagreement between the two churches suddenly escalated and turned into a diplomatic crisis. In order to find a compromise, the Pope sent a delegation led by the French Cardinal Humbert to Constantinople in June 1054. The negotiations between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael proceeded negatively from the very beginning. Humbert presented Michael with a letter advising him to submit to the authority of the papacy. Furthermore, the cardinal's condescending attitude toward the Patriarch during the meetings greatly disturbed Michael. After this, Michael refused to receive the Roman delegation for a long time. The cardinals remained in Constantinople for a few more weeks. Finally, angered by the treatment he had received, Humbert entered Hagia Sophia on the morning of July 16th and placed the excommunication decree sealed by the Pope on the altar before the Patriarch. This was the final straw. The Patriarch, with the support of the Council, first excommunicated Cardinal Humbert, and then the delegation that had come with him. With this decision, the Eastern and Western churches were now completely separated from one another. At first, the people were not greatly affected by this situation. Western and Eastern Christians continued maintaining good relations in the regions where they lived together. However, over time, the tension between the churches also drove a wedge between the peoples themselves. With the Crusades, disagreements intensified, and in 1204, when the Latins captured Constantinople, the conflict reached its peak. Over the years, negotiations aimed at reconciling the churches mostly remained unsuccessful. The problem between the Eastern and Western churches has still not been fully resolved even today.